Why is this different than other times? Why is this just so shocking to us? John, would you like to go ahead first?
Well, on one level, I don't know that it is, as you've framed it, it's not totally new and shocking. This is part of a long history of conflict. But the things that are different this time, in terms of just the popular impact, I think, that it is having in the people I'm talking to and in my own being here, one thing is the fact that this has been captured on video, and people are watching buildings being blown up, and also the fact that 2 civilians were killed. Those add new elements, and the people I've talked to, that they're actually seeing scenes of war in Korea, very near Seoul. So they, everyone knows the history and they know things happen, but the fact that they're watching it on cell phone video, on CCTV, that I think is somewhat new and significant. And then the fact that 2 civilians died, I think also, civilians have of course died in the past. The largest number, I presume, since the armistice would be the terrorist attack on the Korean Air flight. But even recently in the Kumgangsan resort, a civilian was shot, causing that whole resort to close down, and it's still frozen. So it's not that civilians have never died before, but that does put it in a different category, I think, for people here.
Brian.
Yeah, I would basically agree with that. Yeah, I mean, the new thing about this again is that a civilian populated island was shelled, and not simply a military installation. But we have had examples of this before. North Korea has for decades actually been acutely conscious of South Korean public opinion, and has for the most part, with those few exceptions like the KAL bombing, done its best not to alienate it. I think the terrorist attack on that airplane in 1987 really was a result of a North Korean panic about the Seoul Olympics coming closer. So for me, this is really the strange thing about it, is that they are willing to risk alienating South Korean public opinion by attacking civilians. Now, I think that the concern in regard to South Korean public opinion is what made them stage this during a South Korean military exercise. I'm sure Pyongyang is well aware that a sizable part of the South Korean public is willing to bend over backwards to give North Korea the benefit of the doubt. And we've seen that already in the South Korean left-wing newspapers from the past few days. While they do join in the general condemnation of Pyongyang, they're also quick to point out that North Korea did complain about these exercises and did not receive a significant response to them. And they're saying this attack was perhaps the inevitable byproduct of the lack of dialogue between the two Koreas, and so on. So I think it's not just the South Korean public who are being gradually habituated to these things. The North Korean regime probably is also becoming habituated to South Korean indifference. I think they realize they have very little to lose, that when they do provoke South Korea, the South Korean people are very quick to focus their blame on the Lee administration, whether it's for not protecting its citizens enough, for not getting the sailors out of the water fast enough, or for having let North-South relations deteriorate to this point where hostilities become likely.
John, back in April, during the Cheonan warship sinking, there has been concerns about China's growing role on the Korean Peninsula. And during your New York Times interview, you had mentioned that South Korea's concern about China's rising dominance over North Korea in economic terms is well-founded. Now that we are very much concerned about China's position over this North Korea issue, it has been in the news since last night about how China is going to react and what actions they're going to take about this, and how this will impact the U.S.-South Korea as well as U.S.-China relations. What steps should the U.S. take now, and what if China stays stubborn about this in terms of protecting North Korea about this incident?
Well, China looms over all this actually from a number of different perspectives. From the South Korean perspective, it's a concern of China's rising influence and the fact that basically China is the only open door right now for North Korea. And so long term, that's a big issue of concern, especially in certain contingencies. That's a huge issue of concern for South Korea. It's an issue of concern for the United States, and I'm expecting a negative spiral in U.S.-China relations imminently. I'm waiting to see what the Chinese Foreign Ministry says in their statement that I think is scheduled for today, where presumably they'll say something about the U.S. Going through with sending an aircraft carrier into the West Sea. So that's something we can talk about more. That's kind of a major conflict waiting to happen between Washington and Beijing. China also looms for North Korea itself. North Korea, is not. It's not ideal for North Korea to only have China as the active kind of partner in this dance. They would prefer to have multiple players. So, on the one hand, they're going to take advantage where they can of China backing them up to some extent. On the other hand, in the long run, they don't want to be totally dependent on Beijing over and over. So as far as the next steps, again, I think the one big question right now, obviously, is what's the role of the UN Security Council? And it'll be interesting to watch the South Korean government decide their strategy. I think in the end they got burned with Cheonan. I mean, that was not a diplomatic victory in terms of UN Security Council, and I think that explains why there's some caution right now about what the strategy is. Frankly, I wouldn't expect China to get on board with something strong coming out of the UN Security Council, and I would expect China to be relatively vocal, and it's a question of just how vocal, in opposing sending the aircraft carrier, in talking about the fact that there were military exercises, that's the context for this conflict, that was the context for whatever happened with Cheonan, and so the obvious implication is, why do you keep doing these exercises, and why are you now doing even more of them? You add on to that all of China's national interests and some strong sentiment in China, at least in the foreign policy elite, if not in the broader public, that China's national interest is involved, that this is right off of China's coast as well, and then it really spirals into a U.S.-China new Cold War dynamic, which is exactly what happened in July.
And how is, in relation to that, how has China been reacting about the recent uranium revelation, the news about the North Korea finally admitting the nuclear facility? No, to you.
Yeah, well, that's a huge issue here. Is the attack on the island derailed whatever process was going on and whatever outcome it might have been moving toward in terms of absorbing that revelation in Washington and Seoul and Beijing and deciding the next steps. I think Beijing's position is very consistent, and it was consistent through the satellite test, the nuclear test of last year. It was consistent through the end of last year. It was consistent through Cheonan. I think it would have been consistent and will be ultimately through uranium, through the revelation about uranium, which is you have to talk to these guys. The way out of this is to sit down and talk. China has proposed a 3-step kind of on-ramp to the 6-party talks to get everyone back to the table. That's their public, and I think that's their back-channel diplomatic focus. And I think they would have tried to, turn the uranium revelation in that direction to say, look, at least they're telling us more about what's going on, and that'll be on the table too. And some of the many American unofficial interlocutors have been traveling to Pyongyang, myself included, in September. There have been 4 or 5 unofficial American trips to North Korea since late August, starting with Jimmy Carter. Those groups have been receiving fairly consistent signals that North Korea is ready to go put stuff back on the table and negotiate. And obviously you're going to get people who say, oh, it's going to be more salami tactics and it's going to be more this. That's fine. But the point is they were sending a pretty consistent message to get back to the talks, and China has been pushing that. And now we'll just have to see this. This obviously adds a whole new twist and puts puts that even in a more remote likelihood.
So, Brian, in relation to what just John mentioned, the isolated North has become increasingly desperate under sanctions imposed by the international community and the U.S. for its nuclear enrichment efforts. So, what motivates this frustration? Why is North Korea doing this? I know that at the last talk at the Asia Korea Center, you have basically psychoanalyzed every factor. So if you could just help us understand.
Well, what I have to say, what exasperates me and frustrates me when I read the Western press is that I read hundreds and hundreds of pundits, and nobody talks about North Korea's ideology. Everybody acts as if this is some ideology-free zone. It's a country that has nothing in its brain except responses to American stimuli. And it's just not that way. This is a military-first state. It declared itself a military-first state in 1995. At the best point ever between American and North Korean relations. That's something we need to keep in mind. It became a military first state 6 weeks after the agreed framework was signed, after Bill Clinton had sent a letter promising compliance with it as the aid was pouring in. Okay, that's something we need to understand. And the logic behind that was quite obvious. North Korea saw the economic ruin on the horizon, the famine was approaching, and it needed to disassociate its leadership from economic affairs as quickly as possible. 15 years later, we're still in that position. This military-first policy got the Kim Jong-il regime through the famine of the 1990s smelling like a rose. The people blamed their hardship on the United States. But now North Korea is on top of a nuclear pedestal that it cannot climb down from without basically becoming irrelevant, without losing all reason to exist. It cannot shift the focus from military affairs to economic affairs without devolving into a fourth-rate South Korea, which is just not a viable proposition. I say this over and over again. When you are a military-first state, just as an economy-first state has to show constant economic growth, a military-first state has to justify its existence by flexing its muscles on a routine basis, by showing its people that the country is, if not the richer, the more prosperous of the two Koreas, at least the more respected Korea, the Korea that is standing up to the outside world better, that is representing racial ideals better. So, as I say in the New York Times op-ed piece, which should be out in about an hour, I don't like this use of the word provocation. The word provocation, first of all, trivializes everything. I mean, if North Korea stands up and walks out of negotiations, that's a provocation. What we have here is a resumption of hostilities, an act of aggression, and it's being treated as a provocation. Why? We learn in school that if somebody provokes us, the way to beat him is not to respond. So by using the word provocation, we're basically dignifying our own failure to respond to anything. And by using the word provocation, we're also acting, again, as if North Korea does everything simply in response to what America does. And this makes us lose the big historical context, which, if you just look back at the past 10 years, you really could chart a pretty steady escalation in North Korean acts of aggression, starting from the first Yellow Sea skirmish in 1999, the one in 2002 when the sailors were killed, the underground nuclear test in 2006, the shooting of the tourist in 2008. You had that whole spate of missile launchings and the declaration that the armistice was invalid in 2009. Another naval skirmish a year ago. And then we had the Cheonan in March, and now here we are today. And if you look at this as provocations, or if you look at this in terms of smoothing the path for succession, that really annoys me when people talk like that, because the obvious conclusion to be drawn from that is that as soon as Kim Jong-un is sitting safely in power and that whole process is completed, then North Korea is going to sit down and start behaving properly, and then we can talk to it and perhaps get things done. That's not the case. North Korea has to keep flexing its muscles, and it has to keep escalating these acts of aggression, because the North Korean public is not going to be inspired by actions that stay on the same level throughout. Also, we need to keep in mind that North Korea has a big picture here. North Korea's main security threat is not the United States. You talk to refugees, ask them if they were ever afraid of an American attack, and they'll laugh. The main security threat to North Korea is the existence of a thriving South Korea next door. This is even more dangerous now that A, the information cordon has collapsed between North and South Korea, and the North Koreans are able to access South Korean information, and B, since the election in 2007 of an anti-Pyongyang president, that gave the lie to North Korea's central myth, which was that the North Korean people have to sacrifice their own material prosperity in order to strengthen the country so that they can liberate the southern brethren. Well, the North Korean people now I think we can assume, are asking themselves, why should we bother? Why should we keep sacrificing our own comfort, our own health, and so on, in order to liberate people who clearly do not want to be liberated? And I think this is the big crisis in which North Korea finds itself. The big problem is not how do we legitimize Kim Jong-un, because everybody knows in the elite and in the mainstream of the public that successor has to come from the Kim family line. Somebody else would be inconceivable. This is, after all, the Kim Il-sung country, as it's referred to in North Korea. The problem is, how does the state legitimize itself? And this is a pressure that the country is going to be on constantly, whether we recognize North Korea as a nuclear country or not, whether we, make all these concessions, bring them back to the six-party talks. They cannot disarm, because disarmament would mean committing political suicide. South Korea can allow swallow a few military defeats like this, but the North cannot. The North cannot be seen by its people to be making concessions, to be seen to be backing down.
Thank you. And now I'll turn it over to you guys. Evan.
Well, to your last point, Brian, and John, you can jump in. It seems like that then rules out South Korea ever striking back militarily, because if North Korea suffered a defeat that really became public in North Korea, then they would just really have to escalate very, very rapidly in order to maintain this last little shred of legitimacy that the state has.
Yeah, well, I think that it is true that if the South Korean people do respond to North Korea, they need to be aware of the consequences. And I think that was the mistake that was made last November when the South Korean Navy sent that North Korean ship limping over the NLL in flames. The South Koreans basically had dealt North Korea a very significant defeat, one that they could not take lying down. So I think in that sense they should have been better prepared for what came last March. On the other hand, what is the alternative? As I say, North Korea is going to keep escalating. Do you allow them to keep... I mean, they're going to cross a point sooner or later where the United States and South Korea have to respond. And it seems to me that China needs to be made aware of that fact, that if it wants... It cannot prop up this country indefinitely, because this country is going to bring down ruin upon itself sooner or later. Its ideological needs place it on a collision course with the outside world, and no amount of diplomatic gestures from South Korea or party talks or negotiations or avoidance of military exercises is going to change that. And I think if the Chinese could be made to understand that they don't have on their border some late Cold War, former Cold War ally, they have an ultra-nationalist, ultra-militaristic state that needs to be seen on the far right of the ideological spectrum, then I think perhaps they might change their posture towards North Korea. Part of the problem, I think, is the Chinese are not aware of North Korea's ideological discourse. They're not aware of how little real respect the North Koreans have for China. I read an article a few months ago in a North Korean magazine about how Zhou Enlai said to Kim Il-sung, you are the greatest revolutionary in the world. You're the hope for the revolutionary movement. It's an indirect slap at Mao Zedong, but it makes clear to the North Korean people that North Korea is on top. When you have a race-based way of looking at the world, when you consider your own race to be inherently morally superior to all other races, then it follows that even friendly races are not to be trusted. So I think we tend to exaggerate China's influence over North Korea in order to rationalize our own inactivity. And we need to understand that China, no country, can have much of an influence on the domestic politics of an ultra-nationalist state. You just need to look at let's say, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan in the 1930s. Those two nations didn't trust each other and were completely powerless to influence the politics in each other's states. Anyway, back to your point. South Korea needs to know that it has to respond. South Korea needs to know what a response would mean. And if South Korea were to best North Korea, even in a small-scale conflict, I think North Korea would be unable to take that line down, because if they were to do so, then the legitimacy of this military first state would come into question. It's a bit like, speaking of diversionary conflicts, it reminds you of Argentina and the Falklands War. As soon as they lost that conflict, they were out of power.
Can we just look at it from inside the North Korean perspective? We're asking a lot of questions of where's the snapping point for the South Koreans under attack. From the point of the North Koreans, what kind of safety valves are there installed in this ideology when you're talking about the continual ratcheting up of tensions? There must be some kind of line for them as well, that they realise there's a point where they bring destruction upon themselves.
Do they realize that is the question? Because because ever since the Korean War, and you could argue that the Korean War itself that North Korea's aggression during the Korean War itself went unpunished to the extent that we actually stopped at the DMZ when we had the Chinese on the run, and ever since then, every single act of North Korean aggression against South Korea has gone unpunished. Just look at the Blue House, for example, where you had a situation which clearly called for the United States to stand by the defense treaty with South Korea and retaliate against North Korea. Nothing happened. The Pueblo, the Panmunjom Acts, and all these lines in the nuclear sand that they've been crossing for the past 10 or 15 years. And you have a Cheonan, they sink a South Korean ship, and a few weeks later the ruling party loses the regional elections. If you're North Korea, what has history taught you? Has it taught you to be afraid, or has it taught you that South Korea will never respond because South Korea is afraid of Seoul coming under attack? If I were them, I would be feeling pretty impregnable right now.
John, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I have it should be said, I work off of a slightly different framework. In terms of these questions about, for example, the question about military response and how the options are limited, I basically come to the same conclusion, but for a different reason, simply because I think I don't disagree with the whole side of the system and the regime as described by Brian, but I do think there's another part there. I do think there's a pragmatism, certainly in the government. It may be because I've spent too much time with North Korean government officials themselves, including in New York, but including on a recent trip to Pyongyang in September with a group talking about economic issues in North Korea. We weren't getting long diatribes about Juche, self-reliance. You cut pretty quickly through that to a much more practical kind of discussion about their economic problems. So I'm not at all denying there's an ideological overlay on the economic side. It's that we did not hear anyone saying we're okay with the fact that we have a market transition going already on the ground, and so we're going to take a Cuba step, toward managing it somehow. So the ideological change has certainly not occurred, but there is this pragmatism. So in terms of how do you respond to this military act, I think a hard response, a military response, only strengthens the hard element, the militant element within their system. That's what they want. They want an aircraft carrier off their coast now. That's the problem. And we know so little about the moderates, insofar as you can call them that by North Korean standards, and especially now. When I say we, I mean Washington and Seoul, because the channels have been cut over the last 2 or 3 years. We have very little sense of what they could use, what would be a useful international response now to strengthen their position vis-a-vis those in North Korea who want to continue the kind of escalation that Brian has described.
Can I jump in there? This is something that really sort of exasperates me, another thing. We're seeing the success of North Korea's propaganda tactic of basically allowing certain groups into the country, pragmatic line, who lead them to believe that there is some conflict between doves and hardliners in North Korea, as if Kim Jong-il is sitting there at the table saying, you doves make a good case, let me hear from the hardliners now. And of course the implications that the United States has to strengthen the hand of the doves. This card was played on us all throughout the Cold War by the Soviet Union, and we fell for it all that time. And then afterwards, in retrospect, it turned out, hey, there wasn't much conflict. And in Korea, anybody who knows really Korean organizational decision making knows that factions in Korea do not coalesce around ideological lines. I see no evidence to support this whole Selig Harrison kind of notion of different ideological people jostling for power in North Korea. I realize why that serves North Korea's interests, but we need to keep in mind that only certain people are allowed into North Korea. Me, I haven't got a prayer. I was already told that I'm worse than a journalist. I can't even go in there on a tour visit. The people who go in there are the Leon Seagal, the Tony Namkung, these kind of people who are already willing to look at things from what they think is the North Korean point of view. But what I say is, it's not so important what a foreign visitor hears behind closed doors. What is important is what the North Korean people themselves are told on a daily basis. What is important is North Korean actions themselves, and what kind of ideology do they reflect. They do not reflect this pragmatic desire to get the economy going. They realize that kind of message has to be sent out in order to undermine the hardliners in our camp. But I certainly don't feel that what is being said behind closed doors to foreign visitors is any more relevant now than it was when the Nazis were talking to people behind closed doors in Munich in the 1930s, and we were all hearing about what a reasonable guy Hitler was when you really got to know him, you know.
I just like to come back to where on this idea of a form of pragmatism. As they're ratcheting up these attacks, they're still within a zone where they know there's some, well, are they doing it? In a zone where Lee Myung-bak thinks, maybe I don't have to respond to this. There must be a point where they know, if we take it to say, if we shell Seoul, if we shell Gwanghwamun Plaza,
right,
we know at that stage we've got a full war.
Well, I don't think that kind of a war is likely, and I know that the North Koreans don't consider it. Well, we tend to make the mistake of, for years I've been hearing Kim Jong-il will never attack North Korea because that would be the end of his regime, and he's not suicidal. What they don't realize is there are various options between peace and all-out war, and we're seeing them right now. What I think, if I were Kim Jong-il, I would be looking much more at just a gradual escalation of tension, an escalation of acts of aggression, with the aim of both habituating the South Korean people to these things and bullying them into some kind of sort of a Finlandization in which they yield certain powers or they make important concessions to North Korea. North Korea has been dreaming for decades of a confederation where the two Koreas would be sharing certain powers through a confederation above both of the Koreas. They've always looked at that as a transition. But if you're North Korea, you've got to get rid of South Korea in order to enjoy security. Any kind of deals that you strike with the United States are actually going to be counterproductive, because as soon as, say, the North Koreans were to open an American embassy in Pyongyang, that country would lose all reason to exist. The North Korean people will naturally ask, if we're going to work with the Yankees anyway, why don't we do it in a country where we can go to sleep with food in our stomachs? And no amount of economic growth or economic aid, we hear from these, about the importance of economic growth to the North Koreans. They know, Kim Jong-il knows, that he could achieve 25%, 40% economic growth every year for the next 10 years and still not be close to catching up to South Korea. In other words, economic growth does not mean political capital for him. And economic growth is prioritized on a very low level accordingly.
Yeah, well, I certainly disagree with that. I mean, if he could achieve those levels of growth, the North Korean people will not have a problem with it, because their daily lives will be improving so dramatically.
The question is, will he be willing to sacrifice anything to achieve that? Naturally, if he's going to get economic growth, who would not want that? But my point is, he is not going to shift the focus from the military to the economy, because that's a no-win area for him in terms of political charisma.
That may be, but I think we shouldn't overplay the fear, the fact that North Korea can never change because it can never catch up with South Korea. I mean, in part because of the fact, as you've referenced, the information cordon has broken down to a great extent. So North Koreans are increasingly aware that the gap already exists. They already know they're starting from way behind. So, I'm not saying he will do it, but if he did, and if the economy started to significantly grow, that will generate some legitimacy.
growth.
Even though people know they're nowhere near South Korea, it won't suddenly collapse because there's a year of growth.
Well, I mean, the very fact that they're engaging in actions like they did on Tuesday shows how little importance they place on economic growth, because obviously whatever economic goals they had for 2012 have become that much less likely as a result of these actions, as a result of the Chanam. This is a country, again, I say do not listen to what is said to foreigners behind closed doors. Look at their actions. Their actions show you what their priorities are. This is not a country that is behaving like a country that places any kind of importance on any significant importance on economic growth, or it wouldn't be behaving in this way.
Or do you think they've decided now that mighty and prosperous nation mantra, they think maybe the prosperous was a bad idea?
Yeah, well, that's
we
I would agree.
Here.
Yeah, the problem. Yeah,
go mighty.
It's an example of a propaganda apparatist losing the plot, which it's been doing ever since Lee Myung-bak was elected. They made that very rash promise of North Korea attaining to the status of a strong and prosperous country in 2012. In January 2008, a couple months after Lee Myung-bak was elected, and they really began to worry about how they're going to continue inspiring their people in the face of the awareness that the South Korean people voted for the anti-Pyongyang candidate. At the same time, I've been looking at these at the propaganda posters and propaganda information about 2012. They are downscaling public expectations. For example, posters of the strong and prosperous nation that appeared about 6 or 7 years ago had a table covered with chicken and beef and things like that. And now you see very similar posters, but the table is completely, vegetarian, vegan, and this shows me that they are trying to downscale public expectations for the prosperity part of it. We've also, what worries me also is these reports that we've been hearing from NGOs and from Radio Free Asia, that the North Korean party is telling its people, we cannot become a strong and prosperous country before we unify with South Korea.
Okay, Brian, I must cut you off right here because we only got 8 minutes left. We'd like to give an opportunity to other reporters. So if anyone else has a question.
I'm sorry if you've already covered this, but I just wondered if there's anything that we can read from the North Korean official statements since Tuesday, the sort of speed of the response. I think people were talking about within 4 hours there was some kind of official statement. But then I think last night the lead item was Kim Jong-il touring a soy sauce factory. So it seems kind of mixed messages from the propaganda machine. I mean, what should we make of that, if anything?
I'm not sure what to make of that. I mean, they did respond quite quickly with the TV woman, fulminating, and North Korean propaganda usually does not react so quickly to events. It leads me to think, it certainly gives extra reason to believe that this was planned in advance. Other than that, I don't know. They can't make too much of this attack for their own people. I would assume that the propaganda value of this attack lies primarily inside the military. It's something with which the military can congratulate itself for it and so on. But an attack on a civilian populated island in South Korea is something that's actually quite difficult to square with the North Korean propaganda view, or the North Korean propaganda message, which is that the North Korean military is there to liberate those South Korean civilians from the Yankees. So I think the propaganda value of this for the public as a whole in North Korea is probably quite limited.
Do you feel the general apathy here in South Korea advances at all the opposition party's engagement agenda? I mean, do you see any political points being won by the opponents of Lee Myung-bak, by just the general lack of interest by many, especially young voting-age South Koreans?
Definitely. I mean, the general response here is well, so far, I mean, it hasn't really coalesced yet. It's very difficult to say right now. But from what I've seen in the newspapers and from talking to South Koreans here, is this feeling that, well, this is what happens when you don't talk. Okay, which is of course the message that the North Koreans want us to receive. When Iraq, for example, circumvented sanctions, the United States said, well, now it's time for us to attack. But when the North Koreans ignore sanctions and continue with their acts of aggression, people actually go the opposite direction and say, well, now it's time for us to talk to them again. It's time for us, in other words, to reward them for their hostility by sitting down and making concessions and talking to them. And that is pretty much the general South Korean response here as well. I mean, I can understand it naturally. It does make certain rational sense when you look at the options that are open to the South Korean people, but it certainly sends the wrong message to the North Koreans. And just as the non-response to the Cheonan sinking made the artillery attack on Tuesday more likely, the non-response to this event is going to make another attack likely. And what we also need to keep in mind is the Chinese are not going to take this incident any more seriously than the South Korean public does. Yeah, the Chinese look here at a country that is basically indifferent, or at best slightly concerned, and yet the South Korean government seems to expect them to want to put their own, relationship with North Korea on the line. And the South Korean public needs to realize that this is not going to be prioritized anymore in the outside world, and they choose to prioritize it themselves.
Do you agree with that, John?
No, I don't agree with your characterization that people are indifferent, but what is that based on? I mean, we're all associating with as many people as we associate. But the South Koreans I've been with the last 2 days, indifference would not be the way I would describe their reaction.
Do you feel it's been the same as more so than after the Cheonan incident, or do you think they've been
That's definitely
more?
I would say they're definitely more concerned. What the astonishing thing is the lack of indignation and anger, okay, which I think is going to be restricted again to the geriatric, military veteran right. And those are the kind of demonstrations that we're probably going to be seeing in the next couple of days. But what I see from people basically is fear, is concern that this is going to turn into something else. And that's something quite different from a wave of anger at North Korea for having done something like this, which would be the natural response, I think, in most other countries.
For the record, again, I'm not seeing the same thing. I've seen anger. You're never supposed to do this. I know this from doing stuff in China. You should never rely on cab drivers. But on the ride over here, in my broken, halting conversation with the cab driver, he described crying when he heard the news about the civilians dying, and then he described the anger and the fact that all the cab drivers are pissed off. Now that's one example. The people I was with yesterday, older generation, there was outrage, there was anger, especially again at the fact that civilians had died. Does that mean they want a military attack? No. Does that mean that is that compatible with them possibly supporting engagement even now? Yes, absolutely. Is it a reward for this bad behavior to somehow try and sit down and talk with North Koreans at this point? No. The reward for the bad behavior is going to come Sunday in the form of the aircraft carrier.
Which is really nothing. I mean, to conduct exercises off the coast of North Korea, let's face it, that's not a significant problem for them. It was really sad after the Cheonan sinking when the Americans, first of all, moved the exercises to the East Coast in response to China's objections, and then said, we have shown that we are not going to let something like this happen again. Well, guess what? It happened again a couple of days later, precisely because that show of resolve was not a show of resolve. It was an effort to restore face. And that's all that exercise is going to be on this weekend as well, an effort to restore face. It certainly is not going to do anything to deter North Korea from doing something like this again.